she'd hear me call, and I was just calling for the first time in maybe a couple of weeks to find out if I could come in to see for a migraine treatment. She'd hang up the phone on me. She'd hear that it was me. Like someone would transfer me and they'd say, well, Allison's here. And they would transfer me to her, and then I'd say, hi, this is Cameo Garrett, and she'd click, hang up the phone. That's without any prior kind of altercation or problem with her at all. So then I would call again and say, I'm not sure why I was just hung up on. But I'm having to call again because I need to find out if there's someone who could see my son or for me for whatever reason. Or what should I do in this situation? And she would do this over and over and over. And then when I was in tears and I'm crying, she'd start harassing me. So then, after a couple months of this with her specifically, I started to get upset, and I think at one time I didn't curse at her ever. I didn't call her names, but I think I kind of yelled a little bit lightly, and all of a sudden I heard this click like she was recording it. And I thought, you know, she's trying to record, she provokes me for months. And then she records the one time that I'm upset, rightfully. And I just thought, what is she going to do with that? She's going to send it to Dr. Freed, who is the director of the clinic, or what, the board of directors, and try to complain about me. So she worked so hard on an individual basis at defaming me, along with a couple of guards that she knew who are also Catholic, that I even was banned from going to that clinic. And it was basically on the basis of what she had done. So these individuals who are trying to ban me tended to all go to the same church, most of them. There were very few who didn't go to the same church, and they just seemed to be motivated by money or politics. But a lot of them were going to the same church. And I really couldn't understand why they were doing this to me and my son. So I then had to go to these hearings and say, you know, I have no primary care provider at the moment, and I do have migraines, and I do need to be treated for them. I mean, my pain hasn't gone away. So I said, how do I go from needing 20 cc's of morphine to not needing anything? And during this time that I had this pain contract, by the way, during my entire pregnancy that was in effect for me to go to the hospital anytime I wanted to get shots of morphine, I think that I used that, I took advantage of it 3 times total in 9 months, period. So it was 2 or 3 times. So it wasn't like I was going to the ER all the time. Basically, I didn't have as many migraines, so I didn't have to go. It wasn't that severe, so I didn't have to go. But after I had my son, the military and the government basically that is responsible for triggering them started assaulting me with them again. And I was put in a position of not having any pain treatment again. So when they knew that refusing to treat my migraines the first time for so many months had triggered a suicide attempt for me, when they did it the second time after my son was born, I think that they were hoping for the same thing to happen. And when they then added additional forms of torture on top of that, they expected and hoped that I was going to kill myself. And I didn't, because I had, the only time that I'd ever thought about doing anything was the one time, and that was it. It never crossed my mind after that. And I wouldn't do that to my son. So they tortured me again, and I was being called a drug user when I wasn't, and it was just retaliation. I was then in a very bad position, and I didn't know at that time that my son and I were then going to be assaulted with additional forms of technology. So one of those forms of technology, basically after this one person, the police refused to take this one report of rape. I think the police were worried that, you know, if I had one report that where I had evidence backing me, that maybe I'd have credibility. So whoever was in charge just didn't want to take the report. And after they refused to take it, and I, was complaining about that, I was also not only just asking for records from the FBI. At that time, I started asking for records from the local police too, because I needed to have documentation showing how many times my car was vandalized, because I was going to take that to somebody and show that I had an extreme and excessive amount of hate crime against me from one state to the next. So I was trying to get records and everything, and I didn't have any money at the time, and they all were telling me that I was going to have to pay them. But I still made attempts to get certain things. And both my son and I were at our house the first time that we were targeted. And it was sort of like all of a sudden there was sort of this weird compression feeling in the air, and it was sort of like a sonic boom, but you didn't hear the boom. And yet, even though you didn't hear the boom, it was like you felt a sudden weird compression in the air. It was a really very bizarre thing. And then all of a sudden, when that happened, both me and my son began vomiting at the same time. Violently vomiting. And I took my son, basically it was like I got hit in the head, and I suddenly felt this big compression. And then I started throwing up, and a few minutes later, my son was walking towards me, and he said, "Mama," and then he started throwing up. And he was talking really early. And he was vomiting as violently as I was, and there was nothing in our entire house that was bad. I mean, while I'm single, and now that I'm single, and when I've been tortured, I don't keep the same kind of kitchen conditions that I kept when I had my son and when I was a nanny, or even when I was on my own and not being tortured. When I'm on my own and not being tortured, I always keep a very clean and tidy house. And when I was a nanny, whenever the parents came home, the house was always put together. Even though I said I don't want to be a housekeeper for them, I still did clean up after the kids and, anything child-related. And basically, with my son, I kept my house clean. I had people over. I had different neighbors over. They saw that my house was always clean. And I never left food sitting out. I didn't leave things in the refrigerator too long. I didn't leave food sitting out too long. I didn't leave groceries out after when I was shopping longer than I should, if they had to be refrigerated or put in the freezer. Regardless, whenever it came to something to do with my son and his health or safety came up, there was no fault to be found in me. So there was absolutely nothing that I was giving him at all, and he was still getting all organic food. He didn't have anything besides that. So there was nothing that was in my house or anything that I was doing that would have caused the vomiting. We both got very sick. I thought at first maybe we both got food poisoning at the same time, but then when I got to the hospital, I realized I think it was something else, because when my son and I got to the hospital, my son and I were not the only ones vomiting violently. It was like a section of people in the Wenatchee area all got hit at the same time. And every room in that hospital, besides maybe one room where there was a different injury, like a broken arm or something, I could hear vomiting violent vomiting and continued vomiting like my son and I were having from every single room in the ER at Central Washington Hospital. So my first thought was, oh my gosh, all of these people got food poisoning at the same time. Like, where did we, what is this, something from Grocery Outlet? But there was nothing that was bad from Grocery Outlet or from a place. And there's nothing that would cause this weird compression feeling in someone's head or in the environment, like a weird boom, kind of sonic boom feeling, prior to vomiting. You know, it was that sensation prior to the vomiting that helped me to realize it didn't have anything to do with food poisoning. And clearly, because there were additional people there with the exact same symptoms that my son and I had, it was very clear to me that a section of citizens in the Wenatchee area had just been targeted with something. And the thing that they were wanting to give me was high levels of iodine and potassium, which is what you give somebody for radiation treatment. And I remember thinking that later that was really weird. At the time, I just thought this was how they were treating maybe I was dehydrated or something. But later I thought about it, and I thought, you know, I'm a half an hour from Hanford, and my son's a half an hour from Hanford, and I don't know if it was something to do with a weird experiment that they did with that, or if it was more of a military technology thing, where they use some kind of a sonar or something else that could cause a sudden weird compression feeling in inside of your head, like a very weird, basically like you got hit with something. It was a weird feeling. And it kind of felt, it was sort of like the effects, it was sort of like a bomb. And it was basically like a bomb. It was how it felt. It felt almost, there was a little bit, I almost think, I want to say that the house shook a little bit, but I don't think it did. It was more like, it was really hard to explain. But it was kind of like the pressure from a sudden, like, I say bomb in the sense of like, it was suddenly like all of the air was just like, felt very compressed in the apartment, and then suddenly, boom, like a release of that compression, and then all of a sudden my son and I were both vomiting. And it was probably some form of energy through the energy department in some way. But all I can say is that at first I thought this is really weird, and I kind of thought, I didn't know what to think. And then when I got to the hospital, that was the first time I ever thought, are they doing some kind of a weird research on people over here? Because I noticed other people had the exact same thing. And at first I thought, we all have food poisoning, and that's what I said to the doctors. Maybe it's food poisoning or something, or they said that. But then later I thought about that compression feeling and everything else, and I thought, what are the odds that we just all happen to be eating the same thing at the same time, and we're all throwing up in the same way and having convulsions over it? I mean, even if it's just not very likely. And because of the other sensory things that were happening at the same time, it was most possible that it was something else. And at that time, they took my son away from me. It was maybe the second time that ever occurred, and I didn't want them to. But they took him into a different room, and I don't know what they did with him, and I've never felt good about it, because after he came back from that room, basically he was sent into a different room to see Dr. Beller, out of my sight. And after that visit at the ER, when we got back home, my son wasn't talking anymore. And the entire week following his speech, he was trying to talk in the same way that he had been talking before, and he was unable to talk. So basically, up to the point of that incident where we were both vomiting, my son had extremely advanced development, and he was already speaking, and I was already documenting the words he was saying and the things that he was saying to me, and I was emailing my mom and different people about it, because he was speaking before age 9 months. And for a boy, that's really unusual too.